This is getting out of hand. Now there are two of them.
I've been a fan of Star Wars for about as long as I can remember. I was introduced to it at a very young age. I've arguably grown up with the franchise, and from the second I started watching the movies, I was immediately hooked. From the iconic opening text to the equally famous space battle at the start of A New Hope, and to my childhood fascination with the characters, there was no way I stood a chance. It was like I could hear the franchise whispering in my ear, "Haha, we've got you now. We are going to waste so much of your time." I think what captivated me the most about Star Wars was that I knew absolutely nothing about it. My dad, who introduced me to the franchise, refused to tell me a single thing about it. Except, of course, that he'd drop me at the nearest orphanage if I didn't watch the films. This meant that, even though the likes of The Empire Strikes Back are nearly 40 years old at this point, famous scenes such as the "I am your father" moment still completely caught me off guard. Thanks, Dad. Aww. Seeing how enthralled I was with the Star Wars movies, it was no surprise that I very quickly started to explore other forms of Star Wars media. I picked up the books, I started reading the comics, I watched the TV shows, and of course, I very quickly started playing the Star Wars video games. I think it's widely agreed that the golden age of Star Wars video games was the early to mid-2000s, and I'm inclined to agree, as pretty much all of my favourite Star Wars games come from this period. Off the top of my head, some of my favourite Star Wars games include the two Knights of the Old Republic games, which, despite having clunky controls and horrific graphics by today's standards, still have two of the best Star Wars stories I've ever seen. Stories that are, in my opinion, even better than the entire Star Wars prequel trilogy. And then another brilliant Star Wars game, for completely different reasons, is the LEGO Star Wars game, of all things. Despite clearly being an elaborate spoof, it's a surprisingly well-made game that allows you to revisit the first 6 Star Wars games in a creative and unique fashion. And of course, who could forget LEGO Yoda's death sound effect? While there are many Star Wars games I love, and I'd happily waste your time talking about them, there was one Star Wars game that stood out from all the rest. One Star Wars game that has arguably wasted more of my time than any other form of Star Wars. And that game is Star Wars Battlefront II from 2005. I've said this before, and I'll say it again. Star Wars Battlefront 2 isn't just my favourite Star Wars game, but my favourite game full stop. I originally got it on Christmas of 2007 for my PSP, and I've since gone on to own it on 3 different consoles, and I still regularly play it today. In my eyes, it doesn't just represent a high point for Star Wars video games, but it's also a good look into what could have been. A third installment to follow on from Battlefront 2 had been planned and was due to be released in 2010. It apparently promised bigger stakes, planet-sized maps, and a massive prequel-based campaign to boot. However, sadly, this game would never see the light of day and was cancelled prior to release. When I heard that Battlefront 3 had been cancelled, I presumed that that was the end of the series, that it was to be dropped and shelved, perhaps in favour of new Star Wars video game projects. And gradually over time, my hopes for a third instalment dissipated and faded, and I began to realise that I would likely never ever see another Battlefront game. That was until June 2013. Following Disney's purchase of Star Wars in October of 2012, it was revealed that EA would be rebooting the Battlefront series. Naturally, I was impressively excited. I remember sitting down to play Star Wars Battlefront 2015, and despite the game having less content than I'd like, I remember thinking just how much potential this new, rebooted Battlefront series had. And when I heard that a new Battlefront 2 had been announced for 2017, my anticipation only increased. This was a game that promised new maps, sequel trilogy Star Wars content, and a new campaign that would tie in with the Disney-era Star Wars films. I was naturally excited beyond measure. I remember getting the new Star Wars Battlefront 2 for Christmas 2017, exactly 10 years after I'd been gifted the original Battlefront 2. I remember popping it into my PS4, excited to play the first fully fledged Star Wars Battlefront game in 12 years. And then I was disappointed beyond measure. Anyone that's familiar with the new Battlefront II will likely remember the massive scandal that surrounded it when it was first released.
But Moocake, the game's been fixed now, it's been completely fixed.
Shut up. All that's happened here is that a broken game has been turned into a playable one. That's not worthy of praise. It should have been fine when it first came out. While it is true that a lot of the problems surrounding Battlefront 2's release have now been fixed, it is in my opinion still a game with a lot of glaring problems that I hope to go over in a little more detail during the course of this video. In this video, I'm not going to be reviewing one Battlefront game, but both of them, back to back. For each game, I'm going to go over the background, campaign, gameplay, and multiplayer mode, and then reach a conclusion for each respective game. For the sake of making this video a little easier to follow, I'm going to be referring to this as Battlefront 2005 and this as Battlefront 2017. So with that all said and done, and without further ado, let's kick this video off and start with the first Battlefront sequel. Star Wars Battlefront 2 was released on the 31st of October 2005. Its launch coincided with the DVD release of Star Wars Episode 3 Revenge of the Sith, and as a result many of the maps and the campaign missions are entirely focused around events that happen in that film. It is of course also a direct sequel to the original Battlefront game, which came out on the 21st of September 2004. Believe it or not, despite loving this franchise to death, I've never actually played the original Battlefront game. However, as it's recently been released on Steam, you can bet I'm soon going to change that. Both the original Battlefront games were published by LucasArts, however they were developed by Pandemic Studios, a developing company that has now been shut down. In 2008, Pandemic Studios was bought by EA, and the following year, in 2009, EA shut them down. It's interesting to think that the original developers were shut down by the very company that would later go on to try and revive the Battlefront series. In many regards, Battlefront 2004 is very similar to Battlefront 2005. However, the first game is certainly more limited. For a start, there's no Revenge of the Sith content, as this game was released prior to the film. However, the game also has less maps, a shorter, simpler campaign, less game modes, no space battles, and no playable Jedi characters. In my mind, Battlefront 2004 was a test run of sorts. It had some very interesting ideas and concepts that could be fleshed out and expanded upon if the game was received well. Thankfully, the game was received well, and a sequel to Battlefront 2004 was commissioned. Many of the ideas in Battlefront 2004 would indeed go on to make up some of its sequel's most interesting and memorable concepts and mechanics. The Battlefront 2005 campaign is a small-scale and simplistic-looking one, but despite that, it's still quite effective. It follows the story of the 501st Legion of Clone Troopers, which later on in the campaign gets transformed into an elite squad of stormtroopers with the very kinky name of Vader's Fist. Chronologically, the campaign starts at the very end of Star Wars Attack of the Clones, and finishes at the beginning of Star Wars The Empire Strikes Back. Many of the campaign's missions are either based around or set during some of the film's main events, with examples being the attack of Geonosis from Attack of the Clones, the storming of the Jedi Temple from Revenge of the Sith, and the siege of Hoth from The Empire Strikes Back. Alright then, so let's just storm the old Jedi Temple. I can't see it be— oh god, where did you come from? What the fuck? Interestingly, your character never receives a name. However, I think that actually complements this campaign very well. Your playable character isn't special or important. He's just one soldier of many that is thrown into a massive war that he likely doesn't even understand or care about that much. This is coupled with the cutscene narrations, which are done by Temuera Morrison, the man who plays the clone troopers in the Star Wars films. His dark and gritty narrations help to further reinforce that this war is miserable and pointless, and that your character, in the grand scheme of things, is completely insignificant. These two things help to give this humble Star Wars campaign a surprisingly harsh and cold, realistic tone which, in any other scenario, might not work very well. However, I think it works perfectly in this game because this game is supposed to deal with the concept of full-scale war. In terms of formula, Battlefront 2005's campaign follows the very generic shooter campaign pattern, Missions comprise of objectives such as capturing an area, defending it for a while, killing a certain opponent, or destroying a certain target. On one hand, it is pretty generic and there's nothing really new here, but on the other hand, this game is, at its core, a shooter game. What else were you expecting? The campaign's design and look is also quite simplistic, especially by today's standards. This isn't just because the graphics are outdated, but also because all of the cutscenes are made with in-game assets. Except for the final level, where random scenes from The Empire Strikes Back are shoehorned in, which ironically are quite jarring. Despite looking humble by today's AAA campaign standards, these cutscenes do a passable job, in some cases even recreating scenes from the Star Wars films. And of course, Tamura Morrison's narrations do help these cutscenes massively. On the whole, Battlefront 2005's campaign is a simple but effective one. Your character has no name, and the campaign story is just a retelling of the 6 Star Wars films from a slightly different angle. However, despite this, I never found myself bored and I was always engaged with the campaign. I think this was partly due to the fact that I could interact with famous fights and scenes from the Star Wars films. However, it's also because this campaign brings a new, darker tone that you could argue was overlooked in some of the Star Wars films. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying this campaign is some form of masterpiece, because it definitely isn't. It is a formulaic, first-person shooter campaign made with in-game assets, and even compared to games made around the same time, it pales in comparison. However, it's definitely not the worst campaign I've ever played either, and if you fancy 5 or so hours of mindless enjoyment, you'll probably get something out of it. Thankfully, Battlefront 2005 is a lot more than just its campaign, and what the campaign lacks is made up by the maps and the gameplay, both of which, in my opinion, are completely stellar. Now, if this game's campaign is a mere good, then the gameplay is excellent. It is, in my opinion, the most memorable part of this game, and it's definitely what's kept dragging me back to it for a whole 12 years. Starting with the ground battles, the game not only offers you a wide variety of maps from the prequel and original trilogies, but it also gives you a choice of several different classes of troops to play as, and each class has its own unique advantages and disadvantages. For a start, there's your regular infantry, who is essentially the all-rounder. He does a passable job at everything, but isn't exceptional at anything either. Then you've got your heavy trooper, who does high amounts of damage to tanks, turrets and vehicles, but is extremely weak when fighting enemy infantry. The sniper class is essentially a support unit. It's extremely weak when fighting enemy infantry at a close range, and it's absolutely hopeless against tanks. However, if you sit back, find a good vantage point, and have a good aim, you can snipe enemies from a distance and basically one-shot kill everything if your aim is good enough. Just make sure nothing sneaks up behind you. That's always fun. If the sniper is a long-range support, then the engineer class is a short-range support of sorts. For a start, it's equipped with a shotgun, so it can definitely hold its own. This weapon is extremely powerful, and if you get close enough to your enemies with it, you can one-hit kill them. However, to compensate this, the shotgun is very slow to reload and isn't overly accurate. What makes this class interesting, however, is that instead of grenades, it can drop health and ammo packs, which you can give to your friendly troopers if they're running low. Also, instead of a secondary weapon, it's equipped with a fusion cutter, which can repair turrets or friendly tanks. The last 2 classes are what I like to call the special classes. They're essentially the elite units, and you can't even play as them unless you've already racked up a certain amount of points in the battle. You get points by either killing enemy infantry or by taking areas. Unlike the first 4 classes, which are the same for every faction, the 2 special classes are unique depending which faction you choose. Each faction has 2 different special classes with their own unique abilities and weapons. For example, the Droidekas got a shield, the Clone Commander has got a massive chain gun, the Botham Spy can turn invisible, the Dark Trooper has a jetpack and a glorified taser, and the Wookiee Warrior is a giant, hairy tank with a fucking laser crossbow. If I were to go through each special class individually, I'd be here all day. So my advice to you is to try them all out, have fun, experiment with them, because they are all completely different to one another. Now, while it is true that the special classes are much stronger and more powerful than the regular classes, they also are much harder to play as. You can't just pick one up and be good at it straight away. You have to practice with them a bit before you're any good, and that's what helps to balance them out within the game. And then you've got the hero class. They're only playable on certain game modes, and they're unlocked by playing extremely well in battles. And well, to put it mildly, they're ungodly powerful. Like, they're far too powerful. For a start, you've got Force users, so Jedi or Sith. They can run at the speed of light, they can jump miles into the air, and they've got a lightsaber that will one-hit kill anything it touches. And you can throw that lightsaber as well, so it's not like range is an issue either. And if you're not playing as a Force user, you're playing as a character that's got a weapon that will one-hit kill anything from any range. So to say that they're a bit overpowered is quite the understatement. If your team is losing overwhelmingly and you unlock a hero, you can literally turn the tide in mere minutes, which makes them a little bit broken. In fact, my only criticism of the hero class is that they are way too powerful. They shouldn't be as powerful as they are, but on the other hand, it is kind of fun to just run around killing literally anything you see. As well as that, the hero class's health works completely differently to normal classes. Normal classes need to pick up health to regenerate it, whereas the hero class can only regenerate health by killing. You need to kill more troops to get your health back up. That's not the Jedi way. Now, there are a heap of different game modes for ground battles, and I'll go over them in a little more detail shortly. However, the most common way to win a ground battle is to either kill all the enemy infantry or to take all the command posts on the map. Command posts are essentially spawn points, and if one team takes all of the command posts, the enemy can't spawn in, and they have 20 seconds to reclaim a command post before the game ends. And if all that isn't flexible enough for you, it's probably worth mentioning that nearly every single ground map is littered with turrets and vehicles that you can just jump into any time you like. Some of these vehicles even need 2 people to control properly, so you actually have to work with your team in order to get an advantage. And it's not like vehicles are restricted to only your faction. If there's an enemy vehicle that's unoccupied, you can just jump straight into it and have all the fun you want. On certain maps, there are also extra factions, and these will either help you out or fight against you depending which side you choose. For example, on Endor, there's an Ewok class, which will help fight with the rebels and against the Empire. On Tatooine, there's a Jawa class, which is kind of on everyone's side. They don't help or hinder anyone. And then on the Jabba's Palace map, there's a faction of Gamorrean guards, which are hostile to everyone, no matter what side you play on. Space battles aren't quite as diverse as ground battles, partially because, well, you're in space. However, despite this, there is still a large amount of choice, and the game mode is still quite open for players. For a start, much like the ground battles having different kinds of troops, the space battles have different kinds of spaceships. You've got your standard spaceship, which does a passable job at everything. You've got your bomber ship, which is extremely good at attacking the enemy frigates, but is extremely weak in dogfights. Then, on the other hand, you've got the starfighter class, which is the polar opposite of the bomber ships. Very weak against the frigates, but extremely good in dogfights. And then you've got the people carriers, which I'll get back to in a second. In order to win a space battle, you have to accumulate a certain amount of points, which can be done in one of 2 ways. The first way is attacking the enemy ships. By destroying one enemy starfighter, you'll get 1 point. However, the other way is by destroying parts of the enemy's main frigate. This will get you much more points by comparison, however it'll also leave you more exposed. There are 2 ways to destroy the enemy's frigate. The first involves taking a bomber and doing it from the outside, but the second involves the people carrier I mentioned earlier. If you're brave enough, you can take the people carrier, fill it with troops, and land it in the enemy frigate. And then it becomes a temporary spawn point for as long as it's kept alive. From there, you can quite literally break inside the enemy's frigate and destroy it from the inside, which is much harder to do, but disrupts enemy ships if you manage to do it successfully. To further compensate this, you can choose to play as one of 2 infantry types in space battles. The first is the pilot, which is more equipped to fighting in space, as he can repair your ship mid-flight. However, the second is the Marine unit, and he's perfectly adapted to breaking into the enemy ship and destroying it from the inside. Now, on one hand, he can't repair your ship mid-flight, but instead of a measly pistol and a bomb, he's equipped with a rifle, a rocket launcher, and several grenades. So if you do manage to successfully infiltrate the enemy ship, it's toast! Unlike ground battles, you can't unlock hero classes in space battles, and there also isn't a wide variety of different maps, because, well, this is space, and there's not much you can do with space. Because of the lack of maps, there's also less game modes for space battles, so while it does have less to offer, it's still nothing to scoff at, and still gives you quite a lot to work with. Like I said, Battlefront 2005 has a wide variety of different game modes, and the most notable is probably Galactic Conquest. This is the turn-based strategy game where you fight it out either against an AI or an opponent for control of the galaxy. You take it in turns to move your ship around the map, attacking enemy planets, defending your own, and also attacking the enemy in space. The winner is whoever controls all the planets on the map. Every victory in Galactic Conquest will give you a certain amount of money, and every defeat will give you significantly less money in a sort of well done, you tried your best kind of way. The more planets you control means the more money you will get upon victory or defeat, and you can then use this money to either buy more playable types of infantry or upgrades, which you can use in battles to give you a significant advantage. In my opinion, Galactic Conquest is the best game mode Battlefront 2005 has to offer, or at the very least, it's the most memorable one. It's certainly the game mode that's kept bringing me back to this game for 12 whole years. The reason I think it's so memorable is because this little game mode shows off the best parts of Battlefront 2005. Everything good or memorable or unique about Battlefront 2005 is shown off perfectly in Galactic Conquest. Capture the Flag is also an available game mode, and at this point everyone knows what Capture the Flag is, so I'm not going to bother explaining it. You can, however, play with either one flag or two flags. One flag mode means that both sides fight for the same flag. Two flag mode means that you've got to capture the enemy's flag while simultaneously defending your own flag. You can also play Capture the Flag in space, and it is, in my opinion, one of the most underrated game modes on all of Battlefront 2005. The Hunt mode is more of a small skirmish than anything else. You play on a smaller section of the map, and each faction only has one playable troop type. The gimmick of this mode, however, is that you can play as factions that aren't available in other game modes. For example, the Wookiees, or the Wampas on Hoth, or the Ewoks. I fucking hate the Ewoks. Seriously, the only reason the Ewoks exist is merchandise. Disgusting! On the other end of the scale, there's the extra large mode, which is essentially just a regular battle, except each side has hundreds more troops. And to top it off, you can't take command posts in this game mode either, which means the enemy is constantly spawning in hundreds and hundreds of troops. It's insane. It's quite fun as well, in my opinion, and it makes for some really good large-scale battle-type scenarios. And then finally, there's what I like to call the rarest game mode on all of Battlefront 2005. The Heroes mode. Now, the reason I call it the rarest is because on the PC version, you can't play this game mode offline. And on other versions, such as the Xbox or PSP, you can only play it on one game map, that map being Tatooine. Essentially, the gimmick of this mode is that everyone plays as a hero. Do you remember earlier how I mentioned that the hero class are extremely overpowered and broken? Well, now picture everyone playing as a hero. Literally everyone. It's fucking carnage. Now, while the gameplay is extremely solid in my opinion, it's not perfect. Do bear in mind that this game is getting on a bit in years, and as a result, it's got a fair few bugs. For example, the AI is extremely clunky at the best of times. Sometimes enemy troops will just run past you as if you're invisible. And then other times, the enemy troops will ignore everyone else and focus solely on trying to kill you. There's also this strange thing that the rebel troopers do, and I've noticed they do it on every single version of the game I've ever owned, be it the PSP or the PC, so I'm not even sure if it's a bug or if it's deliberate. Upon killing an enemy, the rebel troopers will switch to their secondary weapon and continue to shoot at the dead corpse until it despawns. And sometimes they'll do this while just staring at you with these dead eyes and this equally haunted expression. In all my time of playing, I've been fortunate enough never to experience a bug that's broken the game. although I have been told that there's quite a few out there, so watch out for them, I suppose. And let's be realistic, this game is pretty old. It's likely riddled with hundreds of bugs that are either too small to notice or that I've just forgotten about, so why don't you post your weirdest and strangest and most annoying bugs in the comments below? In summary, I think it's the gameplay that Battlefront 2005 really excels at. The game offers you a wide variety of different classes, game modes, and maps, which helps keep everything fresh and makes every single game you play feel totally different to the last. I think it's this, more than anything else, that has helped Battlefront 2005 survive for as long as it has. Despite the game being 14 years old at this point, it's still got enough diversity and replayability to keep bringing players back over a decade after its initial release. Now, I know what you're thinking, Moocake, this game is nearly 14 years old. What the hell is there to say about its multiplayer function? Well, believe it or not, the multiplayer still works. The multiplayer was initially shut down in May of 2014. However, a few years later, in October of 2017, the multiplayer was restored. So basically, somewhere in Disney's headquarters is one dude sitting in the corner running the servers for a 14-year-old game. And whoever you are, sir, I salute you. The multiplayer is basically identical to all the offline gameplay I've just explained. The only real difference is that you fight against other players either instead of or amongst the AI. What's really incredible about the multiplayer, though, is that there's still a reasonably active community. There's still online games going on quite frequently, and even today, in 2019, I can always find a multiplayer game. I've never not been able to find one. Now, to be fair, the multiplayer isn't exactly stable. There's always connection issues, and the multiplayer layout, well, it's prehistoric, but then again, this game is practically prehistoric by this point. However, I think the fact that this game not only still has working multiplayer, but an active online community to go with it, I think that's a real testament to how well this game has managed to do. I've been in some Battlefront 2005 multiplayer games that are genuinely more active than some games that are over a decade younger than it, and to be honest, I think that speaks for itself. There's not much else I can say about the multiplayer, as I've already gone over all of the gameplay and the maps. However, I will say this. If you do get yourself a copy of this game and you fancy a multiplayer partner, hit me up, because I've been playing for 12 years, and not to toot my own horn, but I'm a fucking diva at this game. So what can I say in summary about Star Wars Battlefront 2005? Well, it's got a serviceable campaign, some absolutely brilliant gameplay, some extremely diverse and replayable maps and game modes, and it's even still got a reasonably competent and working multiplayer. The graphics haven't exactly aged well, and there's a few unsavoury bugs here and there, but despite that, it's still a very well-rounded and well-made game that still holds up even today. I would highly recommend this game to anyone that's a fan of Star Wars, and if you wait for a Steam sale, you can quite literally pick this game up for pocket change. I'm not rating the game, I'm just not. I can't be bothered, and quite frankly, I think it's really superficial. You really want, you want a score, do you? Fine, I give this 6 do-its out of 8 do-its. I don't know, can we just move on to the next one, please? Star Wars Battlefront 2017 was released on the 17th of November 2017. Quite obviously. The game was also a direct sequel to EA's first Battlefront game, which was released 2 years earlier on the 17th of November 2015. This game was a pretty mixed bag, mainly because it's what I like to call a skeleton game. There's very little content in it. There's very few maps, very few game modes. You can only play as 2 factions, that being the Empire and the Rebels, and there aren't really any space battles either, so all in all, it was pretty underwhelming. From my understanding, Battlefront 2015 seems to be quite a rushed job. It seems to have been rushed to completion, so its release could coincide with the release of Star Wars The Force Awakens, which was coming out in December of 2015. Obviously, everyone was pretty hyped about a brand new era of Star Wars films, and so to release a game at the same time would certainly cash in on all this anticipation. In a similar vein to Battlefront 2004, it appears that Battlefront 2015 was a mere collection of a few decent ideas that would need to be fleshed out in a sequel game that consisted of much more content. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened. Now is probably a good time to talk about the whole microtransaction scandal. And yes, I know, before you run to the comments and tell me to kill myself, I am aware that the game has been fixed. The progression's been overhauled, it's no longer pay to win, the game is allegedly so much better now. However, it's still not perfect. There are, in my eyes, a lot of issues that are still in the game that are a direct result of the initial pay to win system. What's also worth considering is that this game was only fixed because of the massive uproar that surrounded it. If people hadn't been so outraged, if people had just quietly grumbled or gone, oh well, this is EA, what were we expecting, then the game would still be a pay-to-win mess. Don't get me wrong, I'm extremely glad that this game has been fixed. In fact, it is miles better than it was at its initial launch. However, what you must consider is that this game wasn't fixed for sincere reasons. It wasn't fixed because EA was genuinely sorry. It wasn't fixed because they saw the error of their ways. It was fixed because EA needed to do damage control. So yes, while the game is much better, it isn't better for any genuine or honest reasons, and that still leaves a bit of a bad taste in my mouth. Upon initial release, Battlefront 2017 was almost entirely based around a system of loot crates and pay-to-win mechanics. If a player decided to purchase a loot box with real money, they would get their hands on much stronger heroes, weapons, classes, and upgrades, which would instantly give them an advantage over players who hadn't bought them. Of course, you could grind for these heroes and upgrades instead. However, it would take an extremely long time, and the odds of unlocking them without paying were extremely slim. And what this essentially meant was that unless you paid, you were at a constant disadvantage to other players, and in order to get on their level and stand a chance of winning frequently, you had to also buy these loot boxes. It was a very efficient system of forcing people into buying things. The icing on the cake to this entire situation, though, was that hero classes were locked, and in order to unlock them, you had to grind for about 40 hours. And that 40 hours doesn't include loading screens or waiting in lobbies. That's 40 hours of solid gameplay per hero. Unless, of course, you bought them. EA's response to the locked heroes stated that they wished to give players a sense of pride and accomplishment upon unlocking heroes, and it very quickly became the most downvoted comment in all of Reddit history. And it is arguably this that sparked the massive change and overhaul in Battlefront 2017. And after Disney finally got involved following all of the uproar, the system was overhauled and the pay-to-win mechanics were taken out of the game. Nowadays, Battlefront 2017's system is a lot better, and I'll get into that in a bit more detail later in this video. There are no longer any loot boxes or pay-to-win mechanics, all heroes are unlocked from the very start of the game, and while there are still some microtransactions, they're entirely cosmetic and don't affect player progression. Battlefront 2017's campaign is absolutely atrocious. I'm sorry, but it just is. It is easily the weakest thing this game has to offer, and I really wanted to like it. That's the worst bit. I really wanted to like it, but I couldn't, because it's terrible. Before I verbally abuse this campaign, and I assure you that's exactly what I'm going to do, I do have to give it the little bit of credit it has where it's due. For a start, it looks absolutely incredible. The graphics in this game are gorgeous, and the maps, despite being quite linear, are just absolutely stunning. The voice acting is also on point, in my opinion. Every actor involved in this does an absolutely brilliant job with what they're given. What brings this down a little bit, though, is the dialogue itself, because it's one hell of a mixed bag. Sometimes it's genuinely well written and interesting, and then other times it's just pointless exposition dumps. And then finally, there's the sound design, which is absolutely phenomenal. Like, this is easily the best thing about this campaign. Everything from the sound of your own blaster, to explosions in the background, to the roaring of ships overhead, even small things like rain or the rustling of trees are just done perfectly. And if it weren't for the terrible plotline, it would be one of the most immersive things I've played in a very long time. This campaign genuinely looks, sounds, and feels like Star Wars, which is brilliant, but you need a good story and plotline to support it. And this campaign doesn't have that, which means all the wonderful things I've just listed, the graphics, the sound design, they all suffer because of the absolutely atrocious plotline. So the campaign follows the story of epic gamer girl Iden Versio. She's the daughter of an Imperial Admiral and the commander of an elite squadron of stormtroopers known as Inferno Squad. The story kicks off with Iden being captured by the rebels, except spoilers, she hasn't actually been captured. It's all an elaborate plan so she can sneak onto the rebel ship and delete a load of sensitive information concerning the Empire's plans. We break out of our cell by contacting Iden's special Imperial droid, which is a pretty cool game mechanic. It's just a shame it isn't used for the rest of the game. How do we contact this drone, I hear you ask? Well, we use our helmet, which is conveniently in the corner of the cell. Like, I'm pretty sure everyone in Star Wars wears helmets with inbuilt technology and communicators. You didn't think to just take a helmet out of the cell? No, you just left it there? Alright, fine. You know what? I'll give this one a pass, because if there's one thing the Star Wars universe lacks, it's common sense. So we break out of our cell, we delete the information, and then we flush ourselves out of an airlock, which is precisely what I want to do to myself after playing this campaign. And once we've escaped the rebel ship, we're introduced to the rest of Inferno Squad, and there's a very lazy scene where the game tries to show us just how epic and close this little squadron is. Some time later? Really? Are you that lazy? What the fuck? So after some time has passed, we find ourselves on Endor in a mission that coincides with the events of Return of the Jedi. We kill a few people, the Death Star explodes, our loyalist Imperial characters seem totally underwhelmed with the fact the Death Star just exploded, then we kill a few more people, escape in some TIE fighters, there's a really decent space section and it looks remarkable, and then we meet up with Iden's dad and he tells us the Emperor's dead. And again, no one seems to care. Iden's daddy tells us that the Emperor's final decree was a certain Operation Cinder, which Inferno Squad is tasked with carrying out. Our first step in this operation is to gather a load of satellites. And then 15 seconds later, we're told in a cutscene that we've managed to obtain the satellites. Great, that could have been a mission, but alright, I don't care at this point. Then the rebels attack us, there's a half-decent space mission, the space battles are the best thing about this game, and then we're tasked with destroying one of the Emperor's old strongholds, in case the information falls into rebel hands. This degenerate from Inferno Squad is sent to carry it out, and during his mission, he meets Luke Skywalker, who we get to play as. Now this mission starts off looking very promising. You're playing as Luke Skywalker, you get to hack a load of stormtroopers to pieces, and there's even some very well written dialogue. And then the whole thing falls flat on its face. You're tasked with defending Agent Miko, whose name sounds like he comes from the Muppets, for a whole 5 minutes while he sets some equipment up or something, and you've got to defend him from bugs. That's it, nothing else, just a load of bugs. It's about as engaging as it looks. This is the one and only mission where we see and get to play as Luke Skywalker, arguably the most influential character of all Star Wars, and the best you could give us was pest control. Like, do I even have to point out how bad this is? Next, we're taken to the planet Vardos, which coincidentally is Iden Versio's home planet. We then learn that Operation Cinder's plan is to destroy this planet full of Imperial loyalists, along with several others, to spread fear. That's the plan. Like, the rebels just destroyed the Death Star and humiliated you. You could attack them, you could, like, counterattack, but instead, you're gonna blow up a load of planets full of people that support you. That's your plan. Alright, Iden and Muppet Person aren't overly pleased about this, whereas the third Inferno Squad member, I think his name is Hask, I can't remember, that's how uneventful this campaign is, Hask's perfectly fine with it, he's like, oh, this is a great plan, let's do it. So Iden and Muppet Man decide to defect. Bet you didn't see that coming. 5 missions into this Imperial-sided campaign, and we've already defected to the rebels over the most pointless and ridiculous reason you could ever come up with. We then surrender to the rebels, help them destroy the Operation Cinder satellites, which are now attacking Naboo, and then we get to play as Princess Leia, who's defending Naboo from the ground. And for most of this mission, all we do is defend Agent Muppet while he sets up a load of equipment. Exactly like the Luke Skywalker mission. Like, okay, at least we're not killing bugs this time, but it's still just as uninspiring. From here on in, there really isn't much else to say about the campaign, as it becomes totally forgettable. You just do random missions for the Rebellion, either as Iden Versio or various characters from the Star Wars universe. There's one mission where you play as Han Solo. That's decent because it's really different to all the other monotonous missions in this campaign. There's one mission where you play as Lando Calrissian, which starts off promising, but then you get into an 80-80 and it just becomes a pointless, monotonous slog from there. At this point, I am totally uninterested with this campaign. It has just devolved into complete shite, so I'm going to try and get this over with as quickly as possible. In the last 3 missions, we're tasked with going to Jakku, the opening setting of The Force Awakens. There we meet the Empire on the ground, we manage to defeat them, and as we're flying back up to the Rebel ship, Iden's dad attacks us. Iden conveniently crashes on the Star Destroyer. There's a pretty decent section where we fight our way across the top of a flying Imperial Star Destroyer, and then we break in and try to capture and rescue Iden's dad. However, he realises at the last minute that the Empire is flawed and that Iden was right, and sends her to an escape pod where she escapes and crashes on Jakku. Seriously, you could take a shot every time this campaign does something really cliché or generic and, well, you probably die. We then crash land on Jakku, Iden meets up with Agent Muppet, and they make out. Great. Forced romance. Because forced romance in Star Wars always works, doesn't it? And that's the end of the campaign, save of course for a half-interesting sequence where you play as Kylo Ren right at the very end. The campaign in total is about 4 hours long, and yes, I'm aware that there's a DLC. I think that's about 2 hours long, and to be honest, I couldn't even be bothered playing it because it looks just as boring and uninspiring as the main campaign. In short, despite looking and sounding incredible, this campaign has got one of the worst stories I've ever had to sit through. It's incredibly cliché, it's over-reliant on fan service and nostalgia, and the story doesn't really go anywhere or do anything interesting because it can't steal thunder from the Star Wars films. Like I said, the campaign is easily the weakest thing about Battlefront 2017, but hey, if you somehow manage to ignore the terrible plotline, you might get a few hours of mindless enjoyment. Now that the campaign's out of the way, I can hopefully go on and give this game a little bit of credit. Other than the campaign, this game does not have much to offer in terms of offline gameplay, but to be honest, I'm okay with that. It's quite clear that this game is more catered towards an online multiplayer experience, and while I'll talk about the multiplayer in more detail later, I will say that it is pretty good in my opinion. Arcade is the only real offline game mode. It's essentially short PvP matches on a smaller sized map. It makes for some good split-screen multiplayer, and there's even some battle scenarios, which are essentially short missions that you carry out from one of the 3 Star Wars eras. There's also 3 tiers of difficulty for these battle scenarios, and the harder difficulties can actually be quite challenging and fun. On the whole, Arcade seems to be a sort of practice ground. It allows you to try out various heroes, classes of troops, and on the higher difficulties it allows you to test yourself as well. And that's basically all there is in terms of offline gameplay on Battlefront 2017, so seeing as I've got nothing else to do with this section, I might as well talk about the game's progression briefly. Battlefront 2017 definitely seems to be catered towards more casual play. Anyone can just pick it up and have a go. However, with that being said, in order to actually get good at the game, you are going to have to sink a fair few hours into it. Essentially, it's easy to learn, but hard to master. Like I said, all pay-to-win mechanics have now been removed from this game, and even the loot boxes are almost non-existent. The only 2 loot boxes left are the daily crates and the cosmetic crates, which you can buy with in-game currency and state exactly what's in them. In terms of player progression, it's primarily revolved around star cards. In order to upgrade a class or hero, you have to play as that class or hero. And skill points are non-transferable. You can only use those skill points on the class or hero you played as to get those skill points. While this works perfectly fine on its own, the star cards themselves do throw a bit of a spanner into the works and do unbalance the game a little bit. Essentially, star cards are like upgrades. You can equip up to 3 at a time, and each star card will do a different thing. For example, it might give you more health, or it might make your health regenerate quicker, etc, etc. To unlock star cards, all you have to do is level up, and using experience points, you can then upgrade these star cards to make them even stronger. What this essentially means is that if you're a high-rank player, you're going to have a lot of extremely powerful star cards, whereas if you're a new or casual player, you aren't going to have many at all, and you will be at a disadvantage to other players. When the game was originally launched, the idea was that new players would buy upgrades to keep up with high-rank players. However, now that the pay-to-win mechanic is thankfully gone, your only other alternative is to just grind. And this means that for a lot of your early game, you will be at a disadvantage to many other players. Don't get me wrong, this new progression system is a million times better than the pay-to-win one, but it still isn't perfect. This grind-to-win formula will essentially punish you until you've played a certain amount of the game. At the very least though, I do know that if I run into a player that is considerably stronger than me, they got that strong through actually playing the game and not just buying their way to the top. The multiplayer is where this game is at. Most of the content and game modes are multiplayer exclusive, and while this game is more geared towards casual gameplay, there is still an element of competitiveness, which makes for a good match. Seeing as I've already gone over progression and most of the game modes are multiplayer only, I'm going to spend most of this section on the game modes. I was pretty underwhelmed with the offline content of Battlefront 2017. However, the multiplayer definitely makes up for that, and over the past year and a half of updates, it's managed to become an extremely enjoyable experience in my opinion. Galactic Assault is probably the main game mode of Battlefront 2017. It's a linear, more story-driven game mode, and each game is split up into smaller sections, with each of these sections having its own unique objective. As you progress through the game, completing sections and objectives, you'll also progress through the map. Essentially, every time you complete an objective, you'll be moved to a different section of the map for the next one. On one hand, you could argue that this is quite restrictive. You follow a set path, you can't really deviate from it, and there aren't really tanks or turrets dotted about that you can jump into. However, on the other hand, the game never really gets stale, as the objective and the environment is always changing, and you do have to keep on your toes, otherwise you will lose track of what's going on and where you're going. As the game progresses, players will unlock points, either through kills or completing objectives, etc, etc. And then these points in turn will be used to players' better classes, or later on in the game, heroes. This is a good touch in my opinion, as it keeps the gameplay fluid and constant. At the start of the game, everyone will be running around as a regular trooper. However, at the end of the game, you'll see special classes and heroes running around the map like no tomorrow. And this in turn gives you a good incentive to keep up with everyone else, because no one wants to be a regular trooper facing off against a lightsaber-wielding maniac. The hero classes, in my opinion, are a little bit too overpowered. If you manage to become a hero, you'll have a significant advantage over most other players on the field. Now, on one hand, this will affect the balance of the game a little bit, but on the other hand, it gives you an incentive to work for the hero class, because if the enemy team gets a hero before your team does, you're at a serious disadvantage. On the subject of heroes, you've got the heroes versus villain mode, which is essentially the game mode where everyone plays as a hero class. Thankfully, over the last year and a half of updates and combat overhauls, this game mode has gone from a button-mashing nightmare into a reasonably fun experience. Nowadays, each hero and villain has got different stats, meaning they all feel and work completely differently to one another. For example, some are more offensively designed. They're quick and aggressive, and they're designed to attack the enemy head-on. Whereas others are more defensively built. They're not as quick, but they've got much larger hitboxes, they're better at blocking, and they're designed to push forward slowly. Now, this game mode isn't perfect. It can devolve into chaotic button mashing at times, but on the whole, it's pretty enjoyable and much better than it was at launch. Space combat is great. In terms of mechanics, it's the best game mode that Battlefront 2017 has to offer. However, on top of this, it seems to be more of a fair playing field as well. I mentioned earlier that ground battles can sometimes be quite unbalanced, with new or casual players being punished and at a constant disadvantage. However, this seems to be less of a problem with space combat, and newer or casual players stand more of a chance. Much like the hero classes, every ship has different stats and feels uniquely different to the other. For example, TIE fighters are quick and agile, whereas ships such as bombers or the Millennium Falcon are much slower and stronger. And if you combine this with the various space game modes and the brilliant mechanics, you get some really good gameplay, and I definitely got the most enjoyment from space combat. Other than the big and obvious game modes, there's a lot of smaller ones you can try out as well. I'm not going to go over all of them in this video though, mainly because I don't really have an opinion on a lot of them and there isn't much to talk about. One that I did really enjoy though is Strikes and Blasts. This is a more close quarter traditional shooting game mode which sets you up on a much smaller map. It's hit and miss in my opinion, but can make for some really interesting and challenging gameplay sometimes. And then you've got what might just be my favourite game mode on all of Battlefront 2017. Ewok Hunt. This batshit crazy game mode reads as 1/3 Hunt from the original Battlefront, 1/3 Infected from Halo, and 1/3 pseudo-horror. It is weird, it is strangely funny, and at times it is genuinely terrifying. You play as a squad of stormtroopers in the dead of night on the planet Endor, and your only objective is to survive long enough to be extracted. However, hidden in the dark are a load of terrifying furry midgets that will jump out of the dark at any second and kill you in the blink of an eye. That's right, kids, the Ewoks aren't just soulless merchandise anymore. They're now genuinely fucking creepy. In order to survive the night, you'll have to stick together with your other teammates, and if you do die, you come back to fight for the Ewok side. Despite this game mode pitting you against small, hairy excuses for merchandise, it is surprisingly tense, and I would highly recommend everyone gives this game mode a shot. It is surprisingly fun. On the whole, Battlefront 2017's multiplayer is a blast, and definitely the best aspect of the game. It's where most of the gameplay and the content is available, and definitely makes up for the lack of offline content. Yes, it's still not exactly perfect, it's pretty unbalanced at times, and the progression system is still far from perfect, but it's a massive improvement from launch, and despite the problems I've had with this game, I would have to recommend you give this a try, even if it is just for the multiplayer. On the whole, Battlefront 2017 is a pretty mixed bag. On one hand, the campaign is god-awful, and there's an underwhelming amount of offline content. But on the other hand, the progression, the mechanics, and the multiplayer have seen massive improvements, and they've really helped to pull this game out of the dirt. As of now, in its current state, Battlefront 2017 is a pretty good game, in my opinion. It's just a shame that it took over a year and a half for the game to get this good. The game should have released like this at launch. In fact, if it had, I'd have been extremely satisfied with the game. So yes, the game has definitely improved, and it's managed to somewhat redeem itself in my eyes. It's just a shame that it couldn't have done that from the very start. Wait, what's that? You want me to rate the game? Oh, right. Okay. I give it 4 hello there's out of 9 hello there's. Great. I just want this video over with, to be honest. It's taken way longer than I thought it would. Is this thing on? Fuck. Yeah. I'm doing the outro with my face cam because I am completely and utterly sick of editing clips of Star Wars Battlefront. I hope you enjoyed this video. It's a little different to what I usually do on this channel. I've made super long, in-depth videos before, but they're usually commentary videos. This is my first attempt at a review, and I enjoyed doing it. It was a bit of a laugh. It was nice to try something new, and if this is well received, if people seem to enjoy it, I might do another one at some point in the future. I know for a fact that EA is bringing out a new Star Wars game in a few months, so who knows, I might review that if this does reasonably well. My channel is such a mess at this point. Like, there is no direction. There's, like, commentaries, there's music, I make memes, there's live streams, and now there's reviews. Like, there is just no direction. My channel is such a mess. To the 2% of you that are still watching this video, thanks very much for watching it the whole way through. It is massively appreciated. It does mean a huge amount to me. I do really enjoy making longer YouTube videos, not necessarily reviews, but videos of maybe 30, 40 minutes of length. I can kind of go more in depth on things and, you know, spend a bit more time fleshing things out or cracking jokes. I just really enjoy making longer videos, so the fact that I can make these longer videos and people seem to sit through them and stick around for them, that does mean a lot to me, so thanks very much for that. Oh boy, it started raining. Brilliant. That's going to mess with my audio. More editing work for Mother Moocake. I love it. I just love editing. It's so much fun. Anyway, I think I've rambled on long enough for this point, so thanks very much for watching. I'll have a new video out in the next week or two that's a bit more normal for my channel, so stick around for that, I suppose. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next hecking video. Oh, thank God this video's done.